what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. I have a great guest for you today. He is Kristian Williams. Kristian is an anarchist. He's an author. He's written several books, included Our Enemies in Blue, Gang Politics, and his most recent book, Policing the Progressive City, which just came out on the 10th of this month. So please go buy that wherever you buy your wonderful anarchist literature. Kristian, welcome to Seeds of Revolution. Thanks for being on the show.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. I'm wondering if you could start off by introducing yourselves to our listeners, telling us about how you got into anarchism, how you became an author, and what sort of areas of interest you focus on in particular.
Well, let's see. I became an anarchist in the typical way of a middle-class suburban youth of our generation, which is through punk rock. And then, as I got older, I became involved in actual political work, largely around issues of policing. My intellectual work grew directly out of that. In the course of organizing, first in sort of the police accountability area and then more toward abolition, I encountered a number of questions about how the police were organized, why they did the things they did, and the sort of standard left answers seemed to leave a lot to be desired. So I started researching the history of the police, looking into criminology, the sociology of policing. Started then writing about some of the things that I was finding. Eventually, that grew into my first book, Our Enemies in Blue, which is a history of policing in the United States from its origins until, in the third edition, about 2015.
Actually, and before we get further into your work, when you bring up the origin of policing, that's something I'm actually very interested in and I teach on. So I'm wondering if you could give us a quick breakdown, because I think it's really interesting to debunk a lot of the myths and a lot of the stereotypes that surround policing, especially in the United States. If you could just describe to us, I'm going to say briefly, but I know it's not a brief topic, about the things that most people may not know about the origin of policing in the United States.
Well, the standard history, as it was taught to me when I took criminal justice classes, is that there was this sort of New England institution of the night watch. And as cities grew larger, crime became more of a problem. They became professionalized and moved from this sort of amateur night watchman model to a professional policing model. And that's not entirely wrong, but it leaves out this whole other part of the family tree, which are the Southern slave patrols.
Right.
And part of the argument that I make in Our Enemies in Blue is that the influence of the slave patrols was actually much stronger than the influence of the night watch. And so the slave patrols were these institutions in the South that patrolled between and sometimes on plantations. They were usually attached to the sheriff's office. They worked as sort of these non-professional posses. So like every adult white man had to do a shift on these periodically, kind of like we would have to go to jury duty now. So there wasn't like continuity of personnel over time. So in that sense, they were non-professional, but they weren't entirely voluntary either, right? It was like sort of conscripted. And part of what they did was enforce the pass laws, where slaves had to have passes in order to be off the plantation. But equally as important, and that helped to prevent escapes and that sort of thing. But equally as important, they were seen as a preventative measure to prevent slave uprisings. And part of the purpose of the past laws obviously was to prevent escapes, but equally important was to limit communication among slaves on different plantations. So it made it harder for them to coordinate any sort of action. And what I found is that as the South began to industrialize and there were concentrations of slave populations, not just on plantations, but in cities, the patrol structure moved with the population. And as it was transplanted to the city, it started to take on the characteristics that we would recognize as those of a modern police force. Things like 24-hour duties, things like professionalism, things like continuity of practice over time, increasing judicial oversight, and very rapidly after the move to a more urban industrialized economy, the slave patrols began to look like something that we would easily recognize as a police force. And that happened well before the adoption of similar kinds of police forces in the North, and largely those came as borrowing from the Southern model. So the argument I make in Our Enemies in Blue is that the if we want to understand sort of the lineage of policing and its origin story, we're much better looking to the South, looking to the slave patrols and the combination of racial and class dynamics that were at play there than we are looking to the sort of the conventional history of the New England Night Watch.
Were there direct transfers? And by that, I mean the people who maybe organized or staffed slave patrols in the antebellum South, were they then tasked with establishing or training police agencies in urban areas? Were there the transfers of knowledge directly, or was it more of an inheritance of a cultural phenomenon and a political phenomenon?
So in the South, so the earliest example I found of a slave patrol sort of crossing this threshold into modern policing was the Charleston Guarded Watch. And that happened right around the time of the American Revolution. And in that case, it was like literally just the same agency, right? It's that the organization that was started as the slave patrol then accumulated general law enforcement duties, became a 24-hour operation, started paying its staff, etc., and then just grew into the Charleston Police Force. It was directly continuous in that way. Similar story in New Orleans. The replication of the model from the South into cities in other parts of the country is a little hazier in terms of exactly how that happened. But the thing that was happening at the time was that everywhere as cities grew and became more industrial and attracted larger working populations and especially immigrant populations, the city leaders were looking to sort of modernize their police forces. And there was a lot of exchange between cities in terms of looking at different models, looking at different techniques, looking at different ways of setting this up. And as it happened, once the sort of constellation of characteristics that set off a law enforcement agency as sort of a modern police force, once those came together, they were quickly replicated all over the country. And exactly what the mechanism for that replication is complicated and again, a little hazy.
That's interesting. And I'm wondering if it's possible to draw parallels or even direct importations to countries outside of the United States. You know, speaking to you from Canada, we have a police force in Canada that looks substantially similar these days to the police force in the United States. Canada is still in the Commonwealth with the UK. Canada's police force, I'm sure, was patterned strongly, at least after, the Metropolitan Police Force in London. All of these police forces structurally, to me at least, look the same in 2026. Can we draw lines between those slave patrols in Charleston and how that morphed into modern policing in the United States and how and why modern policing in Canada and England looks today like modern policing in the United States? Is it incidental?
Yeah. So to some degree, there has always been kind of international exchange here. And the Charleston model, or the slave patrol model that again began in the rural areas of the South was actually borrowed from the institution of slave patrols in Barbados.
Uh,
Um,
which were obviously run by the British Empire.
they were already looking abroad, right? The development of the Metropolitan Police in London, that which often gets credited as this like modernizing moment, that actually came quite a bit later than the Charleston model. However, it was a it became kind of a standard bearer, right? It was the thing that other police leaders were looking to as sort of a an impetus for again modernizing. That probably belongs in quotes, but
And they,
the idea.
they were looking to the Charleston model or the London
Well,
Metropolitan model?
so again, the proliferation here was, in historical terms, pretty fast, but it was also in human terms pretty gradual, right? And so they were already borrowing from the Charleston model many places in the United States. But once Sir Robert Peel introduced the Metropolitan Police in London, and that became this kind of like prestige factor, there was more sort of political will to modernize. And also, and I think tellingly, police departments that, like, for example, in Boston, that had already made this change, sort of retrofitted their history to say that they took inspiration from the British rather than from the South. Peel's so the development of the Met in London was itself a borrowing. It wasn't a total invention. There had been a number of local police forces throughout the city, which became unified as the Met. And Peel had borrowed the techniques and the structures from sort of like picked the best of what was being experimented with in these smaller locations. But the fundamental model that he used in terms of uniting them was actually the model that he himself had innovated when he was Home Secretary for Ireland, when he invented the Royal Irish Constabulary. So the Royal Irish Constabulary actually preceded the London Metropolitan Police by, I don't know, a decade or more. And Peel took his innovation there was that the policing in this, nominally part of the home country, but in fact, a colony, was that the policing should be done by, again, quotes around this, by civilian force rather than by the military, right? And then he was like, oh, well, if it works in Ireland, it will probably work with the, restive working class in London. And he applied the colonial model in the very heart of the country. And again, consolidated a bunch of smaller departments and the innovations that they were already making to create the Met. So there's always this, like, throughout its history, there's been a whole series of exchanges and borrowings and imitation, and which makes it a little complicated to cite like a single lineage or a single cause or even a single origin point. But yeah, so all of those things over a couple of hundred years have increasingly converged on a single type of policing. And as it happens, because of the unique position of the United States as a world power following World War II, the American model became increasingly popular among the Western Hemisphere, right? And that has been sort of actively exported through State Department programs, occasionally through Defense Department programs of like training other police departments to look like American policing. And often the rhetoric around this is that, we're going to teach them, instruct them in sort of democratic civilian constitutional policing. But, you only have to look at the way policing is done here to realize that that's not entirely the point.
Yeah, the training and funding as well. Going back to Robert Peel, I find that very interesting. And for those of our listeners who might not be aware of the function of the Royal Irish, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the Royal Ulster Constabulary was, of course, then used as a direct tool of imperial oppression in Northern Ireland. And I think it's very interesting that this initial proto-police force was, from the very beginning, directed outwards towards this method of imperial control. And so that policing, it seems to me from what you said, from the dawn of its modern inception, at least in, Western European context, was in fact directed at imperial control.
So yes, and that exchange has remained. I mean, it's gone through ebbs and flows, but it's been a repeated theme throughout the history of policing. That's the techniques of policing that are refined within the United States then get imposed on other countries that the U.S. is occupying or in other ways influencing. And then similarly, that techniques that get innovated in war zones come back into the domestic sphere.
And I believe that's the subject of one of your books, Gang Politics, correct? Or that's part of what you write about in Gang Politics.
I talk there, I talk about this in the later part of Our Enemies in Blue as well. But in Gang Politics, the book mainly consists of 3 essays, and one of them is specifically about the use of counterinsurgency to police gangs in the U.S., and then the use of gang policing to train counterinsurgent forces that were then deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And specifically that cycle of, the combination of coercive force, intelligence gathering, and legitimacy building, both in, domestic urban areas and then also in actual war zones overseas.
It's interesting. How does that fit in? I mean, obviously, not obviously, in my opinion, it seems to be a part of this process. How does that fit in your thinking with how people like Arendt and Césaire talk about the boomerang theory, that one of the definitions of fascism, one of the chief characteristics of fascism, is methods of imperial control then being imported back into the metropole to control domestic populations in ways that were perfected in the imperial hinterlands when they were focused on repressing, minority groups, different ethnic groups, different religious groups.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, that sort of is the theory. It's just, in the case of counterinsurgency, it's the linkages are very close and the lines of influence move in both directions.
How are we seeing that? I think the answer to me seems yes, but I'm wondering, in your opinion, how are we seeing that today in the context of ICE, what's happening in Minneapolis, what's happening in so many cities in the United States?
So this is a little complicated in that let me talk for a minute about counterinsurgency. It began as an approach to regaining control of sort of rest of colonies, right? And the main theorist of this, especially in the English-speaking world, was a British brigadier named Frank Kitson, who, again, going back to Ireland, happened to be the man in charge of forces on Bloody Sunday.
And just sorry to interrupt, Kristian. Just as a side note, I find it so interesting how much of what we see as modern imperial control and the sins of imperialism trace back to Northern Ireland and sort of like the last redoubt of British imperialism that still exists in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate the importance of Ireland for the history of policing.
Yeah.
For, the historical reasons that exactly as you laid out. Anyway, so Kitson made a career of going from like one hotspot in the British Empire to another. And he formulated this theory of counterinsurgency. Wasn't just him, obviously, but he's sort of the guy who wrote the book.
About what year was this?
So this post World War II. So starting in the early 50s, he was active until the mid 70s. And his theory was a couple ways it broke from sort of the conventional wisdom at the time. One was that he thought that in the normal time when everything seems peaceful, that's actually when repression needs to be starting. Because though everything on the surface seems normal, that there are resentments building, there are ideas fluctuating. People who will later be rebels are beginning to like build organizations, make connections, build inroads into communities. And he was like, well, so rather than wait until there's unrest and then respond to it, what we need to do is get ahead of it. And there was actually a pretty radical turn in a way, because what he understood was that the resistance to inequality was actually a result of the inequality. It wasn't the result of, like, before the assumption was that there was always some outside influence that was disrupting an otherwise stable and peaceful society. And Kitson understood that just the fact of oppression meant that it was going to generate its own resistance. It didn't require.
Did that ever give him a pause to question the imperial project that he was a part of solidifying?
If it did, he kept it to himself.
That's interesting. He got so close.
Yeah. And so part of his recognition was that rather than respond to unrest when it occurred, it would be better to prevent the unrest. Another realization that he had was that the government cannot just rely on coercion. That coercion is actually in fact, coercion has costs for the government that often using more coercion makes the government less popular, makes things worse. And what he understood is that the main objective to a counterinsurgency operation isn't the military victory, it's the political victory. And that what that relies on is winning the support of the population. And so he thought it was important to pair coercion and concessions, but the concessions actually did most of the work.
Is this the progenitor of the hearts and minds strategy that the U.S.
exactly.
adopted in Vietnam?
So when the U.S. adopts this in Vietnam, they call it the hearts and minds strategy. The idea is that rather than simply defeat an insurgent group by force, you need to organize the population away from it. Now, in the 1960s in the US, faced with the civil rights movement, faced with the anti-war movement, etc., the police repeatedly worked themselves into these no-win situations where they were facing unrest, and the only tool that they had for fighting it was coercion, and then that gave sympathy to the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, etc., right? And so they kept, like, sort of winning battles to losing wars, right? And partly because of the influence of soldiers returning from Vietnam and joining police forces, there came this conceptual turn where they started incorporating elements of counterinsurgency into domestic police forces. the place where this happened most thoroughly first was in Los Angeles, largely under the leadership of a young police captain named Daryl Gates, who would later be chief of police for practically forever.
And he was chief of police during the LA riots, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Was he a Vietnam veteran?
He was not. But after the Watts riots, he was tasked with basically reorganizing the Los Angeles Police Department so to better be able to respond to situations like that. And what he did was he looked to, I mean, specifically, he met with Marines in Camp Pendleton and asked them how they would respond. And out of that, we got things like the SWAT team. We got riot police organized into squads and platoons. We got the LAPD's helicopter patrol, their armored car division, like all of that stuff. We also importantly got something called the basic car plan, which was that there would be a couple of officers assigned to a specific neighborhood, and they would be in the same neighborhood day after day, get to know the people in the neighborhood, like develop friendly contacts, try to earn trust. And that would be a way of gaining sort of intimate knowledge of the community and intelligence that could be used for the repressive functions. So what we see is, and that would eventually evolve into this thing that became known as community policing. And so ordinarily, especially liberals, think of this as dichotomy, where on the one hand you have the bad militarization, and on the other hand you have the good community policing.
In fact, can't have one without the other.
Both things, they arose in the same time, in the same places, and in response to the same pressures. And in fact, the community policing is itself an expression of the militarization. It is part of that counterinsurgency program. And so the applied to specifically political resistance, part of the counterinsurgency theory relies on, I mean, the main thing is to separate away the population as a whole from the revolutionary potential of the movement. And that depends on making very fine distinctions between different actors that are part of a very broad movement. And to the degree that liberals or reformists can be co-opted, can be like brought into the apparatus of power given access in exchange for limiting their demands, that is a very key tool of counterinsurgency. It's a thing Kitson talked about explicitly. To the degree that the social movement can be given legal, peaceful, non-disruptive avenues for expressing their grievances and even winning concessions, that is a technique for heading off further unrest. And so the police, based on the defeats of the 60s, have been trying to incorporate this to greater or lesser success for 50 years, right? Trump seems to have given up on that entire approach, right? He does not seem to care about legitimacy, and at least not in the same way that anyone before him has. And part of what we're seeing or I guess part of what we saw in Minneapolis especially, was an attempt to just rely on the coercion and to refuse to draw these distinctions between these are the people who have legitimate grievances but are reconcilable with the system as it exists versus these are the revolutionaries or potential revolutionaries. And instead, he just groups everybody together as Antifa, right?
So it's just pure colonial domination. Everybody involved, if they're not wearing a uniform, is a native, and all natives need to be repressed.
Right. And the lesson, is that the counterinsurgency theorists have drawn it turns out is still pretty valid, that the approach of just relying on coercion turns out to be extremely delegitimizing to the authorities, which then accelerates the problem that they were having, right? It builds more resentment, it builds more unrest, rather than the I think the assumption is that well, we'll move in and we'll scare people and then they'll hide. But often what happens is they move in, they make people angry, and then they mobilize, right?
But not always. Why is, and I agree with you in this case, it actually has been delegitimizing. But it not is not always historically delegitimizing. And there are sometimes, oftentimes in humanity's darkest times, in the 1930s, 1920s especially, where it works. And on the one hand, it does gain maybe not a majoritarian, but certainly popular approval, popular enough to sweep repressive parties into power and keep them there. And on the other hand, those people who are opposed, it largely succeeds in either driving them into hiding or exile. Why isn't that working to the same extent now?
I would say an hypothesis is that the historical examples of fascism where it was more successful did build legitimacy, but they built it along other lines and then used that to justify the repressive apparatus and their genocidal agenda. I think Trump, aside from building a cult of personality, has not really delivered on any of the promises that would cement loyalty to his regime. He's not delivered the jobs. He's not delivered the economic improvements. He's, given people permission to be angry and racist, but that's about as much as he's offered. And so I don't think that the one promise that he's really delivered on is to bring the coercion, but the but that's not actually enough to justify itself. And I think his assumption was that the exercise of power alone is enough to justify the power. And empirically, that seems to have not been true.
If there was full employment, say through rearmament, not that the United States needs the rearmament, but in the 1930s, that was the program. If it was full employment with good jobs, then his coercive techniques might be much more successful and scarily so.
I think that's, again, this is not the area where I'm an expert, but I think that's a good hypothesis.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. When we talk about policing, you referred to your book, Gang Politics, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, my question is sort of in the title, but you describe how gangs and police forces operate along the same continuum, using the same sorts of ideologies and even the same sorts of resources. I was hoping you could draw that out for our audience and describe the commonalities between police on one hand and, extra legal gangs on the other hand.
Well, credit where it's due. The theoretical framework here I largely borrowed from the historian and sociologist Charles Tilly, who was maybe the best theorist of state formation, writing in the last half of the 20th century. And he wrote a short and really excellent essay called War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. And he makes the argument there that not just conceptually, but historically, states basically are extremely successful protection rackets, that they often grow out of things that we would recognize in other contexts as criminal enterprises, criminal networks, systems of extortion, and then running the equation sort of the other direction, we can see that organizations like gangs are at their most successful, sort of like micro states and inherently sort of nascent states, that they also employ coercion as a means uh, of marshaling resources, and then use those resources to increase their coercive power. And this is often overlooked, rely on a certain amount of legitimacy, a certain amount of popular support in order to be able to function. That and this is the thing that police understand fairly well, that in order for this is sort of built into the community policing approach to gang policing, where they understand that in order for gangs to function in a community, this relies on a certain amount of the acquiescence of everyone else in that community, right? They at least need to be not causing trouble for the gang, not, informing on the police to the police and that sort of thing. And so part of the community policing approach to addressing gangs is to isolate the gang from the rest of the community. Now, it turns out that, and we talk about this at some length in the book, the most successful gangs don't just sort of prey on the communities that they operate in, although they do, but they do also offer specific kinds of services. They offer, notably, protection from other gangs, right? And again, we you can make an analogy there with states pretty straightforwardly, but they also,
They offer jobs.
right, they offer economic possibilities. They off they also The most successful ones also offer sort of like what would in other contexts be understood as like community programs, right? Like they, give money to the little league team, that kind of thing.
And they offer
And
an identity. I mean, a unifying cultural identity.
yes, and historically that's been, very both expressed in sort of neighborhood terms and also expressed in ethnic terms. And one of the reasons that gangs have taken on a kind of, at different times, a kind of like ethnic character, is often in a reaction to the discrimination and the pressures that those ethnic groups are under. And so they what sometimes begins as a kind of self-defense mechanism, then, and again, we can draw an analogy here to the state, then evolves into a kind of protection racket, right? And as I discuss in the book at some length, a lot of gangs engage in like actual political work. They, you know, did participate in the civil rights movement and similar efforts since then. Some of them like have political action committees that they sponsor and support candidates, and do the like actual like on the ground like flyering, door knocking, that kind of thing.
Well, and
Um,
if we look back to the 40s and 50s in New York, the Italian gangs, aka the mafia, I mean, oftentimes directly controlled the New York political machine,
right.
directly elected the mayor of New York and aldermen in Chicago.
Right. And so if you look back to the period of machine politics, all of this was very institutionalized. The history of the progressive movement, this actually ties to my more recent book, Policing the Progressive City. A lot like the initial function of the progressive movement was to break up the political machines, which largely meant inserting this nominal gap between the criminal operations within the city and the government, right? And some cities more than others, that had the effect of breaking up the political machines and like dissolving that intimate connection between sort of the organized crime angle and the state angle. Although again, some places more than others. Richard Daley, who was, mayor of Chicago for decades, and then whose son was mayor of Chicago for decades, he started his political life as a gang leader. And, some would say he never stopped. It's like, if you look at how he ran the city, he basically just applied the the gangster approach all the way into the mayorality.
That's really fascinating. Before we end, I wanted to turn your attention to an essay you wrote just this past last month, Trump's Economic Lies. And you talk about the logic of applying racial violence to economic problems. I'm wondering if you could describe that and sort of flesh that out for us.
Well, yeah. So, and this goes back to what we were just talking about Minneapolis, where the problem that the real problems that Trump has promised to address are things like are basically the result of deindustrialization in the United States, right? That the traditional working class, often unionized jobs through the long process of neoliberal globalization have largely been pushed elsewhere or have been sort of de-skilled and decayed to the degree that they're no longer the reliable means of making a living for working class people that they were.
Which is now about to happen to white collar jobs as well.
Rather than, and so Trump, especially as a candidate, less so as the president, made some straightforward claims about the consequences of globalization and the way that had affected American workers. However, the only practical solution that he offers to that is to deport immigrants, right? And specifically that has always been cast in a very racialized way and in which there are, real Americans, by which he means white people, and then there are, the subhuman foreigners who are invading and stealing our jobs, by which he means people of color. And rather than address the actual underlying economic issue that is driving the resentment, he has, and his, when I don't want to put all of this on him because obviously, like, there's a lot of blame to go around here,
And it's been in the works for quite a long time.
yeah. And and I don't want to overstate also how new this is with him. This element is actually pretty stable for a couple of decades. But the tendency is to channel the economic insecurity, the economic resentment, what should be playing out as a kind of class politics, into this racialized coercion, into this racialized violence. And that is uncomfortably close to the traditional formula of fascism.
Well, on that bright note, Kristian, I really appreciate you being with us today and speaking to our audience on Seeds of Revolution. This was great. If you want to check out more of Kristian's work, please go to his website, which we'll link in the show notes, and also check out his latest book, Policing the Progressive City, Portland, Oregon, From Settlement to Uprising. Kristian Williams, thank you for being on Seeds of Revolution.
Thank you.
Well, if you're looking for purpose in the current circus, if you're seeking respect and attention, if you're in need of a gig that'll make you feel big, come with me and put some folks in detention. Just last week was kinda tough, I put a kid in cuffs, I zip-tied a lady to a van. We can sneak around town hunting working folks down, I hear they got a great benefit plan. Join ICE, boy ain't it nice. Join ICE, take my advice. If you're lacking control and authority, come with me and hunt down minorities. Join ICE. Well, I failed the academy, the cops weren't having me, the army didn't sound that fun, so I found me a paramilitary operation that was keen to hand me a gun. I got picked on in school, I never felt that cool. There's a hole in my soul that just rages. All the ladies turned me down and I felt like a clown. But will you look at me now, I'm putting folks in cages. At ice for respect and power, joy and ice, I hear they got great hours. There's a sign-on bonus of 50 grand. They're in need of you needing to feel like a man. Join ice. Look at them go. Purpose in the current circus, if you're seeking respect and attention, if you're in need of a gig that'll make you feel big, come with me and put some folks in detention. See, I failed the academy, the cops weren't having me, the army didn't sound that fun, so I found me a paramilitary operation that was keen to hand me a gun. Join ICE, boy ain't it nice. Join ICE, take my advice. If you're lacking control and authority, come with me and hunt down minorities. Join ICE.